This is section 4B of Calvary Cemetery in Queens, one of New York's 5 boroughs, right on the boundary with Brooklyn. Here, among petty mafia mobsters, local politicians and vaudeville entertainers, rests an Italian émigré jointly responsible for 3 of the greatest operas ever written. Lorenzo da Ponte, librettist for The Marriage of Figaro, Don Giovanni, and Così fan tutte. Like his collaborator, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, he lies in an unmarked grave, although there is a memorial to him now. Lorenzo da Ponte, 1749 to 1838. The wording on the memorial mentions that not only was he the first professor of Italian at Columbia University, but that he also founded the first opera house in America, here in New York. Lorenzo da Ponte lived here for a third of his life, from 1805 to 1838, and during this time, New York City freed itself from being an administrative capital and turned into the undisputed artistic center of America, a siren city drawing the greatest composers of the old world to the new.
It was the biggest and most exciting city in the New World. You know, it was the big harbor to the New World. It was the port to the New World. This is why Da Ponte was there. It had an Italian opera house for the Italian community. The Germans, the Scandinavians, they all came and they all would settle in New York as the first place that they arrived.
Classical musicians, singers, pianists, violinists, conductors, and composers, in some ways they were the leading celebrities of music, eclipsing anyone in the popular arena. Classical music was in the center of the culture in New York.
New York is different. I mean, it's different from any other city, and as a composer, you kind of bring your best game. If you have a success, if you feel that you've done something well in New York, it's like having a success nowhere else in the world.
On March the 1st, 2004, at John F. Kennedy Airport in New York, I officially became a composer. I still have the paperwork to prove it. The immigration official actually wrote composer under job description. That was a first for me at the time. Today, still a composer, I've come to think of this city as my home. It's a fantastic place to write music. There's a perpetual buzz of voices, subways, buskers, traffic. A very specific sound which some find distracting. I find it addictive.
96th Street.
This is New York City's white noise. A music of its own, with its own rhythms and textures. As a result, much of the work that I've written here has been influenced by the city itself. When I arrived, I was in the middle of composing a very English-sounding piece called the Dorchester Canticles. You can hear the moment I started working on it again in New York because the music suddenly gets 3 times faster. As I walked around my new neighbourhood on the Upper West Side, I found out that West 84th Street is also Edgar Allan Poe Street. He'd lived there in the 1840s, and so I started reading his work, trying to grasp his take on my new home. I wrote The Ecstasies Above, based on his poem Israfel. It was my own homage to the city as a new New Yorker. But most importantly, New York, a city which is proud of its immigrant history, made me re-examine my own mixed heritage. I began exploring North African music and wrote a chamber piece, Rai, based on a sort of Algerian folk tradition of the same name. Being an old world composer in New York means following in some pretty daunting footsteps. Dvorak, Mahler, Rachmaninov, Bela, Bartok, Kurt Weill, Benjamin Britten all lived and composed here in this city. Others, like Tchaikovsky, Puccini, or Richard Strauss, came on shorter visits to conduct and premiere their new compositions. And these were all important works, even masterpieces. With ad hoc press conferences at the Harbour, sell-out performances in Carnegie Hall, and front-page coverage in the local papers, these composers were, for the most part, adored and treated as celebrities. And the city, in turn, shaped them, drawing these European and Russian composers like a magnet and changing the story of American music as they came here.
Well, New York was becoming a very musical city at the turn of the century, but it conceived of classical music almost entirely as a European import.
Music critic and historian Alex Ross.
So if you were going to be building a great symphony orchestra, you would be expected to have a European maestro at the head of it. It was the European composers coming to America who were really hailed as the heroes of the musical scene. And it was a collector culture. I mean, as one accumulated sculptures and paintings and first editions and so on, you accumulated great music by way of the leading performers of the day and the leading composers. So that was really the mentality, classical music as import.
In 1892, Antonin Dvorak arrived in New York from Prague. He'd been invited by the wife of a millionaire grocery wholesaler to become director of the National Conservatory of Music of America, based in the East Village. His salary of $15,000 a year wouldn't cover anyone's rent here now, but back then it was worth the equivalent of $400,000. His mission? To find the soul of an American classical music. Historian and former director of the Brooklyn Academy of Music, Joseph Horowitz.
One of the things an outsider can do is see things that an insider cannot. Many people think that de Tocqueville had insights into American society and politics that eluded Americans. Certainly Dvorak had a kind of epiphany when he heard African-American spirituals that couldn't really equivalently impact on an American. The premiere of the New World Symphony at Carnegie Hall, conducted by Anton Seidl with the New York Philharmonic, is certainly one of the most pregnant events in the history of American culture. We know, for instance, that every movement was applauded and that the applause after the Largo were so sustained that the conductor, Anton Seidl, turned and gestured to Dvorak's box, and Dvorak had to rise and acknowledge the applause before the symphony could continue. But even more remarkable, it seems to me, are the reviews, in particular, the review in the New York Times by W.J. Henderson. And this is the morning after the premiere of the symphony. Here's what Henderson wrote. He said, "When the star of empire took its way over those mighty western plains, blood and sweat and agony and bleaching human bones marked its course. Something of this awful buried sorrow of the prairie must have forced itself upon Dr. Dvorak's mind. He likened it to an idealized slave song made to fit the impressive quiet of night on the prairie."
Excuse me, ladies. I'm just wondering whether you know the old joke. How do you get to Carnegie Hall?
Taxi cab.
By airplane.
Practice, practice, practice.
For such an icon